There we go. Hi. Oh, the music is once again, there we are. Let's get that music back on there so that people can actually hear it. In fact, I have to fix it from here. There we go. That should work. The unofficial scrub check, 2 hours of tropes to go. You're absolutely right. And the reason that I know you're right is because it's all set up already. We are today doing something a little different, a little silly, maybe a little special, but we're going to give it a shot. We are going to see what we can do about 32 separate troubling PC tropes. Oh yeah, no, we got the whole timer on. Listening on the road soon. That's absolutely cool, Dio, as long as you're not driving and watching at the same time. That's kind of the only thing that we have to worry about at this point. What we're doing here is we are going through 32 troublesome PC tropes. What are those? It's when somebody comes to you as a storyteller and says, this is the kind of character that I want to play, or this is the kind of player that I end up being. This is often something that's based on the character, but it can also be player driven as well. We're going to have a look to see what these are. So how do we satisfy this 100% glitchless run? We're going to have to define what the trope is. We're going to have to state why it's a problem, and we're going to have to state what we can do to try and work with a player to get them what they want while still maintaining a better chance at a harmonious table. Sometimes we're going to come across a trope and there may be a flat, this cannot work, but we always have to be able to provide an alternative, or at the very least, be able to explain to the player why we can't necessarily achieve this goal and to try to direct them to others. I'm in this picture. Well, there's quite a few, and the reason why I've chosen some perhaps more obscure names for these PC tropes is so that it's not as easy. We have to define them. How do I know if I have successfully completed it? I will ask, and if I get a nod in chat that I have successfully completed it, I will then proceed on to the next trope, which means that I'm going to need people in chat to be active, to let me know once they feel that I have accomplished the goal for one particular trope, and then I can move on. We have 32, and seeing as how Clinic Hours is generally a 2-hour show, but we have an intro and an exit, we're only going to start this in about 5 minutes. In reality, what we have is we have 100 minutes, so we have about 3 minutes a trope to do, and some of these are going to be easier or harder because they're going to be based on previous tropes. So we may have to start long at the beginning, but hopefully it'll speed up as we go forward. But I hope that everybody's doing a good, having a good day today. It's Thursday. I did not expect it to be Thursday. I expected it to be more like Tuesday or Wednesday. So I'm kind of happy that my weekend is coming up, that I only have one more day to get through. Because let me tell you, when you have 2 3-day weeks in a row, I assumed that this would be difficult to go right back to 5, but it worked out. So I am not upset. I am not upset. All right. So we're going to let a few more people filter in. It is 5:06 my time. It will be 5:10 in about 3.5 minutes. So you did not expect a scrub check speed style run. So yeah, for those of you who may not be aware, on Wednesdays I stream on my personal channel, twitch.tv/JohnVerrill, where I often attempt video game challenges to see if I can complete them in under 2 hours. It's known as scrub check. My current status is not a scrub because my most recent check I passed, but we're doing it here on RPGClinic. Because why not? Why not? And hopefully I've got it all set up the way that it needs to. I have my splits in front of me. I have my notes to remind me what each one of these characters are. Hopefully I'm not going to have to spend the majority of the 3 minutes discussing why I came up with that particular name. But we're going to see, and we're going to see if I can get it done. So we'll see what kind of time I can get for these tropes itself. No worries, Gilledgood. I'm sure someone else is going to be able to mention things as well. That's not a worry. But if you do have things that you want to contribute to a trope, by all means, throw it in chat. I'll see if I can throw it up on screen as well. And if you have a specific criticism of what I've done, please bring it up. I might even just go back and see if I can fix it for you in that time. We're 2 minutes away from getting this started. Well, had a brief blink on screen there, but I think that's not going to be an issue. And yeah. So, all right, let's just limber up here. It's the first time I'm doing a scrub check in Scrubs. How about that? Down my performance enhancing beverage and prepare. Okay. I'm also looking forward to honestly, in just a few days, we've got the start of Exaltwitch Academy Season 2. That's on Sunday at 6 p.m. over on this channel. So there's that we have to, and I'm pretty excited about that. If you've fallen behind on Exaltwitch, honestly, this Sunday is kind of the best time to get back in. It is the start of a new season. It's the start of new adventures. It is the time. So by all means, if you really want to know what happened in Season 1, you can watch a 2-minute video that we've posted to our YouTube channel that'll fill you in on everything you need to know. If you want all the details, you can always just watch the whole thing if you really want to. But there's no need to invest a whole 60 hours into watching the whole thing if you don't want to. If you would prefer, you can just join us as you were. So we've got a countdown of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. An XP is an export. This is when you take a character from another piece of fiction and you copy it, basically filing the serial numbers off and coming up with a new character. If you've ever wanted to play Batman, if you've ever wanted to play Aragorn or Legolas or Captain America, but you just wanted to do it in a game, but without necessarily emphasizing the fact that you are directly copying, you just put another name on it, that's an XP. XPs in and of themselves aren't necessarily problematic. The problem usually is that you cannot live up to the ideal of that XP because you are not creating the story in a vacuum. You're not writing it by yourself. You're creating the story with everyone else who's sitting at your table, whether your table's virtual or in person. And for an XP to work, if you're really attached to the idea of following the same kind of lines as you've seen in the character that you're basing your character on, you'll find yourself disappointed because other people aren't necessarily invested in making sure that you hit that same level. At that point, the suggestion that I'd have is I'd ask the player, what is it about this character that you're patterning off of that really interests you? If it's involved in their personality is something that you can hold on to, and just remind the player that personality has to be somewhat fluid. You don't know what's necessarily going to happen from one day to the next. If it's an event in their backstory, such as I really liked it that this character got injected with super serum and now who was formerly bullied now can take on bullies himself, a la Steve Rogers, then at that point, what you can do is you can tell the character or tell the player that you can manipulate backstories to a certain degree to make sure that that event happened, but to remind them that the character's future is in flux. This is something that they're going to have to see and participate in with a group of other people they cannot necessarily copy. You'll sometimes reach a player also where they'll deny that they're trying to create an XP when they clearly are. If that's the case, you can pull back a little bit. You don't necessarily have to be focused on showing them the error of their ways, but you do want to make sure that they just steer away from that predetermination point. Sometimes bringing it up and having them deny it is all you'll need to do, that later on in the campaign, if you notice that it's still happening, you can mention, hey, I noticed that you are still trying to follow this path, and I'd like to suggest that maybe the path can be done differently. Have I completed the XP? Can I move on? Waiting for that in chat. As soon as I get the go ahead, I will move on to the Gordon Freeman. This is strange. All right. Split. The Gordon Freeman is a silent protagonist. And in this case, I'm not necessarily referring to a silent protagonist as somebody who never speaks, but instead it's somebody who has no backstory of their own. The only thing that they come into the game with is what other people put on them. This is the kind of person who wants to create a character and they don't really want to put any thought into the backstory at all. They just want to show up and be ready to take on an adventure, and hoping that everyone else is just going to make them fit along the way. It's dangerous to set this precedent, but this is common for casual players. Casual players don't necessarily want to start thinking of a backstory. They instead are just like, well, can't I just start playing? In which case, you have to get ahead of the Gordon Freeman. Work with them to create a very simple backstory, but make sure that they have a backstory that they can look at. Even if that backstory is incredibly simple, it's at least something they can base on and move forward. They have to start developing the habits of role-playing. If they want to role-play with you and your group, and role-playing is something that's important to you, they've got to develop those habits now. In that particular situation, if you haven't created the backstory with them, they're not going to create one on their own. You can sometimes poke a player and say, hey, what about the backstory? And they're like, oh, I didn't realize. And then they move forward and they can continue. But sometimes you'll just get treated by that block of, ugh, I don't know if I want to deal with this. I don't know if it's something that I'm careful doing. Maybe somebody else can do it for me. Resist the urge to just hand somebody a backstory. At the very least, give them suggestions and just ask, do you think you'll have fun with this? And if their answer is yes, then you can keep going, but keep them involved in the process and make sure that they understand that a backstory does not have to be long. It doesn't have to be a novel. It can be 3 sentences if you want it to be, but it's enough to provide a foundation so that you can build a character that can grow and noticeably change over time, which is kind of the hope when it comes to the future. Is that the Gordon Freeman? Luke says, my first and only RPG character is basically just, I got taken to a cult of straight edge and trained to fight monsters by living pure and being clear-minded. Yeah, but like that's enough. Is the Gordon always bad? Not necessarily. If you're trying to introduce somebody when it comes to just the rules or mechanics of role-playing, I would still recommend that you just say, okay, so your character is this and this is their goal. That's great. A backstory isn't necessarily just a past. It's also what motivates them is they enter in media res. But in general, you just want to make sure that they've got something and that it's not just established by you when the thing begins. The Jason Bourne is the amnesiac. Somebody who comes in and doesn't remember why they are who they are, what their name is, where they come from, why they have such special skills. Amnesia is a common fantasy for people because there's something really interesting about rediscovering the self. The problem with amnesiacs when it comes to games is that sometimes it ends up shifting all of the labor of come up with something interesting for me onto other people, specifically the storyteller, but sometimes the other players as well. And not everybody wants to deal with that sort of thing. It's really difficult at times to be able to satisfy somebody who wants something for their character but refuses to define what that is. And that's often what happens when you come with amnesiacs. So in this particular case, what I would do is I would start asking them questions about what they would like to have happened to them and why it's important that they don't remember. Remind the player that their amnesia cannot be an overriding concern for the game unless every player character is amnesiac. that's a specific issue that you'll find players kind of focusing way too hard on that one aspect of their character without realizing that the overall character has to be important as well. In Changeling the Streaming, I had an amnesiac character. Scott played a character who could not remember. I made it clear to him that I was going to come up with what had happened, and that he was going to have to suffer for it. He was fine with it, but he also created a whole character aside from the amnesia. He knew what his character's personality was. He knew what his character cared about. He knew what his character's goals were, even though he didn't necessarily remember the character's past. And therefore, he was able to play the character right off the bat without having the answers of who he was. As the character continued in that campaign, he started to get more and more hints about what was going on with him. And that made it interesting for him. But what we don't have to worry about at that point is that the character is defined by the fact that they can't remember things. That definition is tricky because once the character remembers, they lose purpose. Because if their only purpose is to rediscover their memories, you start running into issues. The advantage to Jason Bourne and the Bourne identity is that the book or the movie ends, but you don't necessarily have that in a role-playing game. Are we clear on Jason Bourne? Whew, I'm gonna have to stay hydrated on this one. I need Ash to come in to remind me to drink. Requiem says that you can write out the backstory but have no memory of it. You can do that, but I often find that players who want to be amnesiac don't in fact want to write the backstory. They want to discover the backstory. The Darkness No Parents. You know where this is going. Orphans. Orphans, when it comes to games like this, it's quite common because oftentimes being orphaned is a shorthand for one of a couple of things. The first is, I don't want to deal with having attachments already. That there's this idea that a hero can only become a hero once they are freed from all other obligations, and family is an obligation. Sometimes it's out of laziness. I just don't want to deal with the fact that I have parents. Sometimes it's about the idea of I want to have had something bad happen to me, and what's worse than losing your parents? This isn't to say that being an orphan is a bad thing for a game. It's just that it is something that involves a little more thought than just throwing it out there. We're used to seeing this in a lot of films because it's a quick shorthand to a character who must develop independence or a character who cannot rely on somebody to bail them out. It often also creates shared loss. This is very common when it comes to Disney films, especially you'll find in the Disney princess genre that a lot of these characters do not have parental figures, or quite often are missing one, usually the mother, so that they are struggling alongside a single father who could not understand them the way that they'd like to be understood. Understand that there are orphans out there. They exist. And much like in any way that you are planning on playing a character, you should be aware of what you are attempting to portray. You should be aware that orphans are a real thing. Orphans are not all critically damaged because they have lost parents. Some of them could be, but not all of them are. Just don't be lazy. When talking to your player about the fact that they wish to play an orphan, ask them why they want to be an orphan. Challenge that. I have found more often than not when I ask somebody, why don't you want to have parents? The answer then immediately starts making them question the decision because they feel stupid. It's not about making somebody feel stupid. It's about making them think about why they've made the choices they've made. If they say, I genuinely want to have suffered the trauma of having lost my parents, then you can explain the concept of fridging to them, the idea that you're killing somebody just to further along a plot, and also explain that oftentimes if you are looking for a traumatic experience, better to start from a position of strength and then loss than start from loss in the first place. And as Gilledgood says, the orphan can be a good character if you're searching for attachments, but laziness is probably not a great idea in general. As with all things, it's a deliberate choice. Make sure that it's a deliberate choice try not to make sure that it is just a lazy choice, because all too often when someone says that they want their character to have no parents or no family, this is the reason why. We good on darkness, no parents? I am the night. I mean, also people who want to play Batman. Don't play Batman. He is the least interesting superhero. The Drizzt Do'Urden, named after the R.A. Salvatore character. This is in fact more of an example of somebody who wants to be the sole exception to the rule. Somebody who comes from a society or a group of people or a race or whatever that has a universal characteristic, and they're the only one who doesn't have it. Now, immediately you have to start investigating your own self. If you've created cultures or races that have cultural standards and that only one person could ever hope to overcome them, do not create why not, Rock Pants, just out of curiosity. Do not create societies that are monolithic in that way. Try not to perpetuate the concept of cultural prejudice. It's totally fine, or at least racial prejudice. It's totally fine if you want to have a culture where, for instance, everybody here believes in one thing and you believe in another. Player characters are very specifically characters who are often different from the norm, and that's fine. Gilad Good, I challenge you. Superman is more interesting than Batman because Batman will always win. And the reason that Batman will always win is because DC says he has to always win. Oh, yeah. Okay, sorry about Batman. B knows my feelings about Batman. And this is more of a joke than anything else. So if you have a Drizzt, then in fact, the issue that you have to look at might be your own campaign setting. If you have a character who's like, I want to be the only one of X who does Y, it is a... Skeleton Friend's actually the one who pointed out Batman to me originally. If you want to have that kind of thing in your campaign, then maybe you have to examine why you have a character who needs to be different in the first place. Once you've done that, once you've examined it, you also have to examine why the character wants to be different and whether they're being different shatters a fundamental axiom about the universe. It's one thing to say, I want to be different than other people. That's fine. You're a player character. You already are. It's another thing, however, to have the player say that the important thing is that I be extremely different, because then they may be unintentionally perpetuating that stereotype in the game that every X must be Y. So that can be an issue. The other issue is that it can break the game's logic. For example, in Werewolf the Apocalypse, if you have a player who wants to be a White Howler, despite that White Howlers no longer exist, you have to explain to them that the concept of that particular tribe, because its totem is gone, because the tribe doesn't exist, you cannot be a White Howler. The concept doesn't make sense. So if they want to, and honestly, the best way that I saw somebody deal with this, other than shutting them down, was to say, you can believe you're a White Howler, but instead the character just thought they were a White Howler, and everyone else realized that it was a Silver Fang with a screw loose. I'm not saying that's a great way of dealing with it, but it was an amusing one, to say the least. Just be very, very careful. A Drizzt is usually a sign that your setting has an issue that you have to overcome. And then talking with your player about why they feel the need to be so different from something is generally where you want to go. We good with Drizzt? Good old Drizzt. I feel like R.A. Salvatore gets shit for Drizzt when maybe it's, it happened a long time ago. The Contrarian is somebody who never, ever, ever wants to listen to the group and instead wants to act against them. The Contrarian sometimes can be found as the mole, somebody who is there and their purpose is to, in fact, hinder the player characters. And sometimes the Contrarian is somebody who just wants to do other things to piss the other player characters off because they think it'll be funny. This is a very dangerous one, and usually one that I would say is not one I'd recommend for any game. The idea of playing a game is a collaborative storytelling experience, and contrarians all too often are actually designed for one thing, which is to amuse the player who's playing them, not to create mirth for everyone at the table. They might insist that it's funny and that it will be funny for everybody, but in general, that doesn't end up being the case. If you have a player who's coming to you and says that they want to do this, drill down into why they want to be contrary. If it's that they just want to be a free spirit, if it's that they want to be challenging everybody, ensure that that character still has the same goals as everyone else at the table, at least at the beginning. But in general, this is one of those tropes where I have to say this is getting as close to a hard no as I'm willing to go in this particular trope situation. It is almost impossible to make a contrarian work unless, as Gil Edgood says, everybody is okay with it and somehow it's able to continue. The story is able to continue. It is my strong recommendation as well to not allow a player to plan on betraying everyone else. If the plan is to betray everyone else, first of all, people are not very good at concealing this sort of thing. And the second is, even if they are good at concealing this thing, it can retroactively ruin the experience for other people because they feel like an unwritten contract at the table was breached. The idea that everyone was supposed to be working together and then all of a sudden it wasn't can retroactively ruin the whole game. So the concept that you have somebody who wants to be a betrayer, tell them to play in a LARP. Tell them to play in a mass game online. Tell them to play in one where player versus player is encouraged, but make sure that they know that at this table, it isn't. Checking to see if we're done on that one, Skeleton for Rent points out here, the attraction to that super special character is usually tied to a need for power fantasy, but it can be less satisfying in practice. It's worth asking the questions posed about why someone might want to be that level of different. Moving on. The Pamtillis, famous for the song Don't Tell Me What to Do. This is a character who just wants to be independent. It isn't necessarily that they want to act contrary to everyone else, but they never necessarily want to listen to anyone else at the table. They either must be in charge or they reject all forms of authority. And to them, authority can also mean the collaborative nature of a group of people. Pamtillis is a singer. So in this case, if you run into somebody who has this kind of, I just don't want to listen to anyone else ever, that's a part of my character, remind them that in typical fashion, if you're playing in a tabletop role-playing game, you are designed to be a group. The group doesn't always have to get along, but the group needs to have a reason to stay together. If your character never wants to listen to anybody and always wants to act on their own, then you are breaking that contract rule of they need a reason to stay together. And if that's part of your backstory, if that's something that you're trying to get to right away, the character may be incompatible with collaborative play. Seek a LARP out, seek a mass game out online. But this is one of those situations where you have to ask somebody why they need to have this sort of thing and what they could do in order to make sure that their character is compatible with the game, reminding them that collaboration is kind of an assumed feature at the start of one of these games itself. We go on Pamtillis, which is, again, the person who says, don't tell me what to do. I told you some of these were going to be obscure. The next one's a doozy. The Lone Wolf. This is one of the most common tropes that you will get presented as a storyteller or even see other people at the table because it is so tempting, because we see the lone wolf so often in literature, film, television, comic books, which are also literature. The idea of playing somebody who doesn't like to deal with anyone and I have no friends and I'm alone in a world that's hostile against me. Unfortunately, very common. Unfortunately, very difficult. Remind the player that lone wolves, when you see them in these other forms of media, typically are able to work as characters because it is scripted. A scripted narrative means that you can create an arc quite easily where where one particular character rejects everyone else and then gradually learns to deal with society again, or gradually understands that everyone else falls away. In a role-playing game, you don't have that luxury. You are not creating a scripted experience. You are essentially playing live, and you're playing live with other people. Remember that you are also shifting the emotional burden of your story onto others. Because typically in lone wolf stories, it's not the lone wolf who manages to bridge the gap. It's everyone else who manages to bridge it for them. You're essentially creating a character backstory that involves everyone else doing the work and you making their lives difficult until you decide somehow that they've done enough so that they can, that you can accept them as friends and move on. It's selfish. It is selfish and it is difficult in an unscripted environment, which means that in order to satisfy the fantasy of being a lone wolf, you need to have that player start thinking in reverse. Try to start thinking about, instead of why does your character want to pull away from everybody? We've established that. Now establish why does your character need to reach out to people? Make it akin to the idea of an actor who is trying to play somebody who's drunk. It is a mistake when you're trying to play somebody who's drunk to play drunk. It is often easier and more convincing to try to play somebody who is attempting to be sober. It's a fine definition, but when you are focused on the physical and emotional effects of being drunk, it often goes way too far. Instead, what you're trying to do is return to normalcy and are experiencing difficulty in doing so. Try to look at this in the same way for the lone wolf. You are alone. You have issues trusting others, and now you are thrust into a position where you have to start attempting to do those things and make that the interesting part of the journey. That puts the onus on the character and not on everyone else at the table to make the fantasy work. You still get the opportunity to be that I'm alone in an uncaring world, but at the same time, you're presenting the character immediately with the challenge of, okay, but focus on what happens next. Lone wolf, okay? We'll see. I mean, sometimes if you need more, I can add more because this is a speed run, right? But I do have to make sure that I complete these properly. I can't just do it I could do all these things in one sentence, but not necessarily the way that we want to go. The D1000. A clever way to say the character who desires to act as an agent of chaos. This character doesn't really have anything that they want to do other than what can I do that would be the most random at this point in time. Often, this is because the player thinks that it will be funny. Sometimes, it's because the player believes that it is adding a challenge that everyone else will appreciate. And sometimes, it's the player genuinely trying to see what it would be like to actually play the Manic Pixie Dream Girl in person. An agent of chaos isn't a player's job. It is, in fact, it would be frustrating and annoying if the universe around you obeyed no natural sense of rule or law. That's not to say that chaos is a bad thing in games, but it is important to note that without any kind of foundation, nothing can be built. And a chaotic character is constantly eroding the foundation because the foundation often begins with the party itself. This is another situation in which you have to start nipping this in the bud right away. Ask the player, what is it about being chaotic that they're interested in? Remind the player that this isn't necessarily going to be fun for anybody else. If they say, oh, but it will, believe me, I'll make it fun for them, then tell that player to ask the other players directly. Say, here's what you're planning on doing, and ask if everyone else is going to be interested in this. But this is a case in which you can often just cite experience, and if you don't have the experience personally, tell them to go look me up. But the idea of creating somebody who is just interested in sowing chaos means that the story lacks a foundation, and without a foundation to the story, it often doesn't work. For a one-shot, this may not necessarily be an issue. Sometimes one-shots are just all about the comedy, and that's all you need. But if you're playing in a campaign, remind them that it is very difficult to set a story down, and then you move forward. This one's not that complicated. This is another one of those, like, it really shouldn't work in most situations. Try to get the player to see it from the perspective of other people at the table. We are with the D1000. It'd be annoying if the world around you obeyed no natural rule. That's how you get Yozis. You are unfortunately correct. The side quest. So the side quest is a character who has a purpose that they are single-mindedly focused on, and that purpose has nothing to do with the main story. Sometimes this is I should have called it the Inigo Montoya, although Inigo Montoya actually was part of the story, so it maybe doesn't work out. But it's somebody who is so obsessed with one thing, and the only reason that they're with other people is either pure chance, or because I have to, or I'm with you, but only until it becomes clear that I can then pursue my real mission. Your real mission, if it no longer intersects with everyone else, basically is you saying, I want the spotlight and I don't want anyone else to share it, because you're not involving other people in that quest itself. Or even if you are involving other people in that quest, it's all about you. And the point of a role-playing game is to share a story experience. Sometimes it will be your turn to have the spotlight, and sometimes it won't. So I would offer to the player that this side quest can be important, but that A, they should make sure that they have a reason to deal with what everyone else is dealing with at the time, and B, understand that this cannot be a major part of the game. Encourage that character to live for more than just their single-minded purpose, because, and you can remind them of this, if the only thing they care about is this one thing, that means that every time someone else is trying to do anything else, they can't be as engaged. And why would you deliberately write yourself out of the game that way? Position it as that. Not but it's going to be frustrating for everyone else. Say specifically, you are going to make it less interesting for yourself. Shift that onus onto the player itself. And you can usually find that they'll understand that maybe it would be in their best interest to move on and try something else instead. So Gilad Good mentions from a previous, from the D1000, ask the player to run a game, even a one-shot, where they unleash their chaos. They can give random events and see what kinds of things people respond to. Yep, that is a way to do it. But often what this is actually at its core is, I don't want to do this. If you want to do this, run your own game and do it there instead. But that's actually a legitimate response to a lot of these things. Some games, okay, so here, Luke says, some games require that though, right? Monster of the Week as the Chosen, a purpose was meant to be a part of that, and all of our PCs had goals other than Group 1. It's okay to have other goals. What's not okay is to be only focused on your other goal and everything else just falls by the wayside. You're either dragging everyone else along with you on a story that they didn't necessarily sign up for, or you're pulling yourself out of the game because you don't care about anything other than your own story. It's fine for your character to have goals that aren't shared by everyone else. It's fine even for those goals to be incredibly important to that character. It just cannot be the only reason you exist, much like a side quest character in an RPG who's only ever there to deal with that. Are we okay on the side quest? Whew. It's a lot of talking, but I think I'm ahead of time. The Chosen One. I'm destined to be the one who is special. Now, this has been called a couple of different things, like the Lost Heir, or the idea of a Harry Potter, an Aragorn. This is a situation where, again, you need to start making the player aware that the game cannot revolve around them unless everybody at the table is okay with that. It really sucks. Hey, Kung Fu Fenders, it really sucks if you also want to declare yourself as a chosen one, and then it doesn't turn out to be. If you are like, but I want to be a Harry Potter, well, what happens when everyone else is also a Harry Potter? You're no longer as special because now there are 3 or 4 or 5 of you instead of just being one of you. You will also run into a situation where if you are trying to say like, but I'm secretly a prince, but I'm a pauper, ask what is it about that's interesting that's not the reveal? If it's the reveal that the player is going for, I just want to have a secret and I want at some point for that secret to come out and for everyone to be shocked and be super stoked on me. That's only one moment in a game that could go on for a long time. That one moment might be perfect for a one-shot or for a very short campaign, in which case, go nuts, go ahead, be a chosen one. But if it's for something that's going to happen for a long period of time, remind them that that one moment isn't enough to base on. And otherwise, choosing a secret that then can be revealed later is a perfectly fine thing to do. Just make sure that there's enough to their character that isn't about the secret there. So, Mistrich, the idea of the chosen one in this particular case is I am the chosen, not one, not we are the chosen one. It's specifically a player who decides that they want to be super special themselves, not anyone else. They want to have that spotlight dropped right on them for them to be super cool and super special. It's the side quest, except that they want to be the main quest. And they want everyone else to choose that that's the main quest as well. They want to be Buffy Summers. Everyone else gets to be the Scooby Gang. It's surprisingly common to find players who want to do this because they want to be like their favorite characters, who often are the protagonists and everyone else is a deuteragonist in that particular case, right? While deuteragonists sometimes get their time in the sun, no one could argue that the show Buffy the Vampire Slayer is actually about Willow or Xander. It's not. It's about Buffy. And everything that happens around them, even though it can be important, even though that it can be focus of one episode or 2 episodes or even a storyline, it's all kind of related to how Buffy deals with the crisis that she's dealing with. So the more like deuteragonist, am I right? Oh yeah, most interesting critter. Absolutely. Totally. So what Requiem says is closer to what I would suggest in this particular case. I did a Lost Air once. Oh, and it's covered. Let me throw the, where is this here? Come on. There we are. I did a Lost Air once. It played no major part in the story. It was just a little flair that explained why they were so pompous, but they accepted the fact long ago that they were no longer going to be a king to this country they never visited. See, you created a well-rounded character there. You didn't just say, the only thing that's interesting about me is that I'm secretly a prince or a king or whatever. Encourage a more well-rounded character. The Chosen One is rarely the most interesting character in the story. Supporting characters are awesome. See, you know this, Skeleton for Rent, and I know this, but that's not necessarily how other people will see that come across, which is also something you know. I'm not telling you something you don't. But this is absolutely true. The Chosen One is often not interesting because they're kind of what everyone else is built around. So everyone else has to be interesting because the Chosen One's kind of like, okay, they're the audience avatar. And the audience avatar is often bland so that we can pattern ourselves off them. The reason why Bella is such a great character in the Twilight series is because she is described as having characteristics that everyone can kind of relate to. I am not too attractive. Well, most people don't think that they're the most attractive person ever. I'm kind of clumsy. Sure, everyone is kind of clumsy. I have difficulty making friends. Most people believe that they have difficulty making friends even if they have lots of friends. it's making somebody who is relatable so that then when cool things happen to that relatable character, it gives you a little thrill because the concept is maybe that could happen to me. But everyone around the protagonist, they're interesting. They're more well-rounded because we don't have to pattern ourselves onto them. They're the wacky characters in our lives. Be the wacky character. Shonen comics. Either shonen comics, Skeleton for Rent, harem comics are incredibly common for these sorts of things, right? Or if you've ever played any visual novel ever, the main character is just you, and you are very boring. And it's everyone else who people want to see and talk to and hear from. So, yeah, you don't want to be Jerry Seinfeld. You want to be George or Elaine or Kramer, if you want to put it in like that. You don't want to be be the cat girls. Don't be the guy who is into cat girls. I don't know. That got away from me for a bit. Are we good on Chosen One? Jesus. What's wrong with me? I mentioned this because this is a very common thing. Yeah, made RPG for the next one shot. Don't fucking tempt me, Miss Rich. Don't fucking tempt me. The unbalanced equilibrium. So this one was suggested by Pukajutsu. It's the concept of having your character be so different than the setting and then forcing the setting to actually mold to your character. So the idea, for instance, for this would be that you're playing mage, but you're playing a mage who specializes in gun kata from the movie Equilibrium, or Equilibrium, I guess, depends on how you pronounce it. And then all of a sudden it's no longer a game about, those who can create and shape and blend the universe to their will, having to deal against technocracy. Now it's actually about people in trench coats doing gun kata things. So this is a situation where a character is on the extreme side, which is sometimes just fine, but then forcing the entire game to focus on their extreme side. In this case, I would ask the player, is this actually the kind of game that you're looking to play? Perhaps you would be interested in either starting that game yourself or finding a better system and a different group of players to play in. Or even if it's not necessarily a different system, find players who are interested in that particular aspect of it. But remember that if you are focused on an extreme, that extreme will not always come into play. Again, make the player start thinking about how often is this thing that I'm really excited about actually going to come up? How long is it going to be relevant? One of the examples, which I know that I've given on RPGClinic's previous shows before, is, say, the character who is blind. You come in, you cannot see. You say, I am blind. And everyone says, oh, that must make it difficult for you to be an adventurer. And you are like, but here are the ways in which I have compensated for the fact that I am blind. And they go, cool. And all of a sudden, you being blind just isn't interesting anymore. Not to mention the fact that you're kind of, fetishizing something that people have to deal with every day. But instead of having a character who's well-rounded, who has a lot of things about them, the whole point of your character is that I'm blind, and yet I also get to do cool shit that supersedes my blindness, or even makes me better off than somebody who can see. It doesn't take very long for that to just go away. In much the same case, if you created a character who is so extreme that you're like, yes, I've managed to fit the Matrix into this mage game, well, all right, fine. But you don't get to be Matrix all the time. There are other player characters, and they're not playing the same kind of character that you are. So unless you are actively engaged in gunplay a lot of the time, this isn't going to work out. You also can't necessarily claim that gunplay will happen just because that person wants it to. Develop a more well-rounded character. And in developing that well-rounded character, you'll find other ways to hook into the system and the setting. And once you've done that, you can generally fit in with everybody else. Every once in a while, you're going to get a chance to play out your cool, extreme character type. but you cannot expect to play it the whole time. We got on Equilibrium. We got on Christian Bale. Christian Bale. And there was a time where that was Christian Bale at peak coolness. The Katarina. Katarina has a voice line in the video game Legends of Runeterra, which is violence solves everything. This is the character who tries to fix everything using violence. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're just trying to kill everything at all times, but it means that if they come across a problem, their solution is hit it until it falls down. I cast Fist. We're going to get to another thing that kind of layers on the Katarina later on, but this is why Katarina? Because I was trying to come up with names for all these things that weren't just standard. That's why. So for a player character who genuinely believes that violence is the only answer, first of all, this may not be a problem. Is your entire game going to be about a dungeon crawl and all you're doing is just beating up monsters and taking their shit? Fuck it. Just don't worry about it. It's oftentimes not even worth trying to argue against it. But if you're playing in a game where you don't want combat to be the entire solution at all times, ask the player if they're going to be okay when that isn't the solution. And if they're like, no, but it will always be the solution for my character, then you have to point out that not everybody is necessarily going to feel the same way. Not every other player character is going to want to solve problems with violence. And what happens then? Does that mean that when they are prevented from attacking somebody, they're going to attack their friends at the same time? This is kind of a situation where you'll get a player who has a narrow focus of what role-playing games can be. This is altogether too common when somebody plays only, for instance, Dungeons and Dragons, and only with certain kinds of storytellers, or in that case, DMs, where the game is all about the war game aspect of it. It's about hitting things, knocking them down, taking their stuff, and moving on. So having the idea of introducing them to a wider side of the world is fine. Also telling them that it's fine if they're not good at things that aren't violence, so long as the player understands that that's an interesting moment for roleplay as opposed to a weakness in game, is one of the things that I would watch out for. But one of the best ways to deal with this kind of player character is to educate the player about the possibilities of role-playing, about opening them up to more than just dungeon crawls. And once they get that, they often tend to get excited about playing a different kind of character. I'll also point out that you can try playing a system which doesn't put as much focus on combat as, for instance, Dungeons & Dragons or Pathfinder. There are plenty of systems out there that have much more robust systems for non-combat, and you can try one of those. There are a ton of them. In fact, I would say these days, most systems that come out have quite detailed systems for not necessarily combat. Try playing one of those. See if that will suit you and also introduce this particular player to a world outside of violence. Good on Katarina. Punching is a negotiation tool. I mean, but that can be funny. The point is, if the player character only ever chooses violence and that is incompatible with everyone else. The Uru. So, also known as the Mystics in the movie The Dark Crystal, this is the pacifist character, the one who refuses to fight, who believes to the very core of their being that fighting is wrong. Normally, this can be a really interesting character choice, but you are also playing a game, and in many role-playing games, not all, but many, combat is a core part of the game experience. This player has essentially said, I do not wish to engage with a large part of this game's experience. Even D&D has a lot of elements that don't depend on violence. It's absolutely the focus. No, it is not the only solution. The problem is that of the books that exist for D&D, 90% of it is detailing stuff about combat. Whether it's here are items that you can use in combat, here are monsters that you can hit and make them fall down in combat, or here are ways in which characters can engage in combat, it's focused on combat. So If you are encountering somebody who says that they want their character to never engage in violence, point out that the game is going to have violence and that they are writing themselves out of the game at that point. Remind them that they also have to have a reason why they're accompanying everyone else. It's fine to play somebody who doesn't like violence. It's fine to play a character who isn't necessarily even good at violence. But if your character is such a pacifist that you refuse to engage with violence in any way, remind them that they are then forcing that decision on everyone else, because either they don't fight or you won't spend time with them. And neither of these necessarily work. How did I get these names? Intense boredom. That's how I got these names. The Uru, the idea of being that pacifist and so pacifist that you'll let everything else go badly if it's an attempt to not fight, can be incompatible with a system or setting. Make sure the players are aware of this. When I get that pacifist, I try to gently, here, let's put it up on screen. I try to gently lean them towards a combat as a last resort. Also, a pacifist could be good for a healer, could explain why they're in a group. So I'm specifically talking about pacifists who abhor violence, who it isn't, I don't want to hurt somebody. It's, I don't believe anybody should hurt anybody, and I don't want anything to do with it. It can also be a problem if you're like, I never want to hurt somebody. But the idea of combat as a last resort is absolutely still just fine. And it is also fine for a player character to not be good at combat. Just remind them that combat's going to happen and they're just going to have to deal with the fact that there will be a significant portion of the game where they're just not going to be as effective. And some people can handle that. We okay on the Uru because we're moving on to the Kevin Uxbridge, one of the more esoteric references on this list, but one that I'm actually particularly proud of. There are also systems with no combat. Maybe this isn't the game for you, even if you want to roleplay. So yeah, obviously for a lot of these character choices, you can say we should play a different game if this is what you want to play. But I'm also trying to make sure that people can squeeze into the game that you want to try and play. Because otherwise I could answer almost every one of these with, yes, this will work, but in another game. The Kevin Uxbridge, in reference to a Star Trek The Next Generation episode, the Kevin Uxbridge is a pacifist who is secretly a tactical nuke. This is a character who refuses to fight, refuses to harm any living soul, but then at one moment could be pushed so hard as to engage their absolutely godlike powers and destroy everything. Well, this can be an interesting character concept, but there's a couple of things that I would point out to this player first. The first is, I can't necessarily guarantee that you can be godlike in your ability to destroy everything. Because then you are investing a heavy portion of your character's abilities in something that you will never use. Some people are okay with this, and then some people realize, oh yeah, wait. But remember that also, oftentimes the rules don't let starting characters be the most badass thing in the universe. You have to start small and get big. So you may not be able to satisfy this particular fantasy of yours, depending on the system that you're running. But the thing that I would remind people more than anything is that the idea of I have an ability, but I will not use it except for if I absolutely have to, this can be great for a limited series. One shots, it doesn't really work because you don't get that chance to sort of be like, I have a lot of opportunities to refuse before I finally get to use my tac nuke. That's cool. But in a one shot, you often don't get a chance. In a long campaign, at one point, you're going to blow your wad and then you don't have anything special about you anymore. And that's no good either. So it's best for a game that maybe has 2 or 3 sessions. You refuse, you refuse, you refuse, and then finally you just take a deep breath and you go. This is the equivalent to like a limited series. I could have also called this perhaps the a la carte. The a la carte is a less extreme version of the Kevin Uxbridge, where you have a character who's like, I am a super badass, but I I'm not allowed to use my super badassness. I have to have permission to use my badassness from somebody else. I have to have my controls unlocked before I get to be super cool. Like Alucard in Hellsing. Or I could go the really fucking lame ass example of this, and I can be the Samus from Metroid Other M. These are situations in which you'll find that you'll have a character. You'll find it that a character who wants to be fucking amazing but just has to hold back. This is just something you have to negotiate with the other players at the table. There is a definite situation whereby players might say, like, it's fine if you want to be a god who cannot be a god anymore, but some players might object because they're like, well, if he gets to be a god, why can't I be a god as well? And if she gets to have all these super badass powers but isn't allowed to use them, I don't believe it, because at some point she's going to get a chance to use them, and then what's the point of my character struggling to do anything? So you just got to be careful with that. Gilad Good mentions, I mean, isn't Exalted kind of always a bit Uxbridge? If you use your powers, you start glowing, people start hunting you, so you have to hold back. The difference is I refuse to use my powers, and then I use them in a moment, but I essentially am so powerful, I am godlike in my power compared to everyone else, that it's a special moment when I finally reveal it. Skeleton for Rent actually points out the way that this trope actually works, and this is, in fact, kind of like the basis of Exalted. A nuke with a huge downside is like with Chainsaw Man. Aki's badass sword comes at the expense of years of his life with every swing. In much the same way in Exalted, start using your powers a lot and you out yourself. Other people can see that you are Exalted because your anima starts to glow. You start sending off beacons of light into the air. And incidentally, more often than not, everybody believes that makes you dangerous, and they hunt you down and they try to kill you. So the idea of having a downside to using your abilities is way more interesting than I have these abilities, I choose not to use them, but I'm definitely going to use them. Because in general, the power fantasy at that point is the player saying, oh, I want a moment where I can be a god. But in order to try to make this appear fair, I'm going to insist that my character also has incredible restraint. This isn't really, like, that's not a downside. That's actually a strength. The strength of, oh, I have all this power, but I don't have to use it. I choose not to use it because I'm better than that. But then in that moment, I can be godlike powerful if I want to. It's no big deal. Means that character kind of breaks the challenge of an area. They're looking to circumvent a system. And if you can remind players that they're not allowed to circumvent a system, that the system's in place to make sure that everybody has a good time, you can generally get away with it. We okay with the Kevin Uxbridge? Oh, glad to hear that, Requiem. That is absolutely annoying when that shit happens. My computer stopped working yesterday abruptly, and it sort of sucked. The punishment / downside makes the character way more interesting and fun to play. Deciding to act and having consequences for that action is cool. Yes, consequences are more interesting than internal restraint in this particular situation. The Trauma Center. This one is also pretty common. The Trauma Center is somebody who has shown up and just has had all sorts of terrible shit happen to them, and they are positively riddled with post-traumatic stress disorder. So why is this problematic? Well, first, post-traumatic stress disorder is a real fucking thing, and it affects a lot more people than you think. It is not just something that people who come back from war-torn countries are dealing with. It isn't something that people who have had an intense physical trauma occur to them. It's not even somebody who you necessarily look at and say, oh yeah, that person had a horrible life. PTSD is a very real situation. So that's one. The second that I'd point out is if everything bad has already happened to you, then the idea that your character is trying to crawl their way out of it is interesting. Sure, that can be a way for your character to move forward. But it also kind of means that you are you're preventing yourself from moving forward if you're choosing to focus on holding yourself back. It's okay to have a character who has mental illness, just like it's okay to have a character who has a physical disability. What's not okay is to then essentially try to define yourself by that mental illness. There's more to a character than one thing. There's more to a character than one bad thing that's happened to them. And I'd also argue that there's more to a character than all the bad things that have happened to them. So if you have a player who comes in with a backstory for their character, and that backstory is just everything absolutely fucking went to shit, nothing is good, everything is awful, and they are super damaged by it, ask them where the positives are. Ask them where the hope is. Because the story kind of needs some hope to go along with it. If it's a story that everyone can engage in and that can move forward, the character needs to be able to move up. And if the character needs to be able to move up, there must be something for that character to latch onto in order to move. Because otherwise, the character is done. And if the character is truly done and they're like, well, that's what I want. I want others to be able to pull my character out of their funk and be able to move forward, then once again, you are actually shifting the emotional burden of your character's story onto the other players. I don't think that's fair. Unless everybody else is totally fine with it. But if your character literally can't get out of bed in the morning, it's going to become really annoying for everyone else to sort of play out every time that you wake up. Okay, who did guard duty? Great, you did guard duty. All right, what spells do I have to prepare for the day? Here are the spells that I have to prepare for today. And whose turn is it to spend 20 minutes trying to talk somebody into getting out of their bedroll so that they can get up and go and rescue the prince? That's not what everybody else signed up for. Role-playing can be a wonderful way to examine the aspects of humanity, and part of humanity is mental illness. But it is unreasonable of you to force that story onto everyone else around. It is a very interesting point to play, but make sure that your character is more than their trauma, and make sure that their trauma isn't going to overly affect or disproportionately affect their character no matter what happens in the game. That's not the game that everybody else signed up to play. I'm also going to point out something that Requiem said, which I think is worth kind of looking at. If you're going to be playing a character with a mental illness, you'd better do your research to pay the illness proper respect. I take shit like that very seriously, but that's me. So I'm going to say something that might not necessarily be all that appropriate. Well, okay, it's appropriate. I'm not about to say something horrible, but I'm going to say something that involves a little bit of thought. If you are playing in a private game with you and your friends and you're alone and you decide that you want to not pay specific attention to a thing, that's okay. Often, not always, but that's okay. If you say, I want to play this game and I know that there's something problematic about this game, but we're just going to ignore it, that's fine. If you say, I want to play this game and I want to play the game as written, even though I know it has problematic elements, and you're alone and you're with them, that can be okay. If you say, I want to play, I don't know, a game like Scion, where you get to pull in gods from other cultures, and you're like, I don't really want to do my research about how these gods and these pantheons actually existed, no one's really going to stop you. Because I very much doubt that everybody who plays Scion goes into, develops a master's degree in theology just so that they can learn how to play Scion properly. That's totally fine. What's not fine is if you start basically using that prejudice without questioning it ever and allowing it to pattern the rest of what you're doing. So in terms of things like mental illness, I'm not saying that you got to go and talk to 50 people who've suffered from PTSD before you can play somebody with PTSD yourself. I'm not saying that you have to spend 200 hours researching about the various different effects and severities and intensities of that disease in order to be able to play it correctly. What I am saying is be careful, because you don't know what everyone else at the table has done. You don't know what they've had to go through. And if you are not being considerate, you are running a real risk. And oftentimes that risk isn't worth taking. So this is a way of kind of saying, if this is something that you've had to deal with a lot in your games, somebody who just is like, I'm just too damaged to function, remind them, people with mental illness function every day. They really do. As I've said before, a game shouldn't be your therapy session. So unless the game is deliberately designed to be therapy and you're dealing with somebody who is a therapist, no, your game is not really a therapy session. If you break down super crying every session that you play because you are trying to play a character and pushing through trauma that you yourself have experienced, that's not necessarily healthy for you or for the other people at the table. Again, some people can absolutely help work through their traumas through role playing without a problem. That's fine. It's totally good. The number of people who I have met who have used games to explore things like their sexuality or their gender or their preconceived notions about other races or about other nationalities. All of this can be healthy. The trick is to not be something that you can't handle and then make it everyone else's problem to handle it for you. Are we okay? No, you were absolutely not too harsh, Requiem. Absolutely not too harsh. Because if it's a veil for you, then that's important. And safety has to be respected in that case. What is important is to make sure that you are not putting your issues and then throwing them at a whole bunch of people who are not qualified and who didn't ask for it. We got to be there for our friends. Absolutely. But I also have to recognize my limitations. I can't fix all of your problems, storyteller or not. Are we okay on the trauma center and moving on? We're slowing down a bit. It's fine, but we got to get through the rest. The Cloud Strife. Spoiler warning for a game that is incredibly old, but Cloud Strife's entire village goes up in flames. Everybody he knows dies. This is not necessarily a PTSD related thing. This is more of my backstory, it doesn't matter, everybody's dead. We're kind of calling back on the Darkness No Parents situation here, but this is the extreme version. I don't have a backstory because literally there's nothing that exists left back there. Other than maybe the antagonist who caused it, and I'm out for revenge. If you don't have a tie to anything, you aren't as interesting a character. So if everybody you know is dead, well, then you don't really have anything interesting for you right at the start. Having something that you can hold on to, having some part of your past that still exists, is a way to make your character instantly far more interesting and far more relatable to everyone else. Try not to play a character who is just showing up having already hit rock bottom, because then you have nowhere to go but up. And nowhere to go but up is actually not that interesting if it's the beginning of your story. Sometimes it's got to get dark, and then you can start turning the lights on. We okay on the Cloud Strife? Cloudstrife. This is oversimplification of role-playing problems 101 right here. The Dante Hicks. I'm not even supposed to be here today. The refrain heard over and over again from the main character in the Kevin Smith movie Clerks. This is the reluctant adventurer, the character who is like, I'm too old for this shit, or I shouldn't be here, or why me, or I don't even want to be doing this. Look, a reluctant adventurer, somebody who has done the refusal of the call, if we're going to start talking about the monomyth, can absolutely work, but those are scripted. Your character cannot be based around the idea that they don't want to participate. That has to be incidental. It can totally work. It can absolutely work. But 37, but it just cannot be a major part of it. If the player comes up to you and says, my idea for the character is that he doesn't want to be an adventurer, that's got to be a minor point. It can be really fun to have somebody who's like, I could be back home and taking care of my cabbages, but I can't take care of my cabbages because I got to rescue the prince. What a fucking asshole. Why does he have to get himself kidnapped every other week? My cabbages are going to suffer. That's fine. That's character. That's okay. But if the character is always looking for excuses to not be on an adventure, well, you're breaking that contract of find a reason to keep the group together. Don't break that contract. And it is one of the things about Exalted that I like that's built into the setting, that the process of exaltation puts in you the need to use your exaltation. It's called Essence Fever. The idea that you must use your stuff. You gotta be out there. You can't just hide away and spend the rest of your life not trying to make a change in the world. So, for the Dante Hicks, it can be an interesting backstory. It cannot be the primary part of your character. We're moving on. Clerks 2 is still good. I mean, look, Kevin Smith movies age differently depending on which one you're talking about, but like, there's no denial that he came along at a time where his voice was ready to be heard. Requiem says, I would say it could work if they actually want to be there with the group. They just say that to have that persona, if you will. Why are you still here? Well, someone's got to make sure your kids don't get into trouble. Yeah, they just have to have a greater motivation to adventure than to stay at home. And then you're fine. I assume Gilligan move means I get to keep going. I'm going to assume it is. Boom. The Dick Thief. But it's actually not the Dick Thief. It's the Dick Thief. As much as I would have been amazing if it was something else. The Dick Thief is the character who targets their allies for fun. The reason why it's called the Dick Thief is because your dick is mine, is because the common trope for this is somebody who plays a rogue and they're like, well, I'm playing a rogue, and so therefore I have to steal stuff, and therefore I'm going to steal stuff from my friends, because that's who I am. I just steal things. That's what I do. I'm a kleptomaniac. So the idea of this is that it's a character who will antagonize their allies. I would just remind somebody that you should get buy-in from everyone else at the table if that's what you want to do. If you want to play the character who's just as a total asshole to everybody else, make sure that everyone else is like, yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun. Ask them, hey, do you think it'd be fun if your weapons disappeared during the night and once again you had to go and get them back from the thief? Well, maybe that'll work. But it is something that I think that you kind of have to put that into, as with a few others in previous categories, this is one of those, you got to check with them to see whether this is actually going to work out or not. Check with the other players to see if they're going to enjoy it. Because also you might have every intention of like, I want this to work out for everybody. I want everybody to have a good time with it. But some players aren't ever going to react well to it, especially newer players who will see, hey, somebody took my sword +1. Well, that sucks. I hate this now because they've achieved a setback. And instead of the person giving the setback is the storyteller who they expect it from, instead it's coming from one of their ostensive allies. And then they can no longer trust their allies, even if it was just a joke. That trust is really important for some people, and then they can't get into the game. So that is the Dick Thief. Mostly you just want to try and make sure that everyone else is okay with what's going on. We good on the Dick Thief? Just here to steal the dick. I hear that you've got a dick problem around here, ma'am. Good, we saved some time on that one. The Casanova. Casanova is somebody who only shows up to fuck. Otherwise known as the horny bard. This is the character who is just trying to hump everything, and if not hump, then at least they want to woo everything. AKA Dick Thief Part 2. There's a reason I put them together. Or somebody who wants to solve every situation that they can by trying to seduce or love. Well, first off, you can introduce the red rule. As stated in numerous things, the red rule is the idea that seduction attempts can automatically fail at any time if the player who is the target says that it does. But I would also point out that somebody who just wants to have sex with everything that moves, this is something that you're just going to have to bring up in a session 0, and you're going to have to make sure that everyone else is okay with it. I've had Casanovas in my games. I've had Casanovas in my games recently, not on RPGClinic, but in recent games, I've had people who are just like, no, I just want to see how many things I can have sex with. You know what? For some groups, that's fine, and it's going to work out. And for some groups, it's just going to be really annoying. So this is one of those things that in a session 0, bring it up. But I would also point out that somebody who only ever wants to try to seduce, just tell them, okay, but make sure that they're aware of the limits to how much you want to engage in this kind of play. If you're like, yeah, you can seduce things, but eventually I'm just going to be like, yeah, great, the character just walks off with you when we fade to black. Is that going to be interesting for you the 50th time it happens? Maybe it will be, and then fine. But some players, are trying to do this because they're secretly trying to get their jollies, and this is absolutely a thing that people have done, in which case that can be a severe safety issue and you really got to look into it. Or B, the person's doing it for a joke, and then you just have to remind them that jokes can be funny, but a joke that happens again and again and again and again often are not. So just ensure that there's more to their character than their desire to get it down. So Punchy gets around. I mean, like, look, it's totally fine to play somebody who is interested in sex. One of the great things about role-playing is that it's a way for us to experiment and participate in sex with low risk and low consequence, as long as you're playing safe and as long as you're playing with consent with everyone else around you. So, just make sure of that. We good on Casanova? I realize that every time I say that and then wait for a response, I'm just leaving dead air. And dead air is murder. The Thick Barbarian. Unlike the Thick Barbarian, the Thick Barbarian is the I'm dumb as rocks, but I like hitting things and making them fall down. Honestly, a lot of the times this is fine. It's no big deal. But this is, again, a situation where you have a character who is probably a joke. The joke being, ha ha ha, look how stupid I can be, ha ha ha, look, I hit it and it fell down, ha ha ha. This is, again, one of those, are you sure that you don't want to be able to engage with things outside of combat? And then beyond that, are you sure that everyone at the table is going to appreciate you just pantomiming being silly? Low intelligence is one of those things that you'll also see. You'll see that some people will use the term fish milk. A fish milk is a reference to a Malkavian, which is one of the clans in Vampire the Masquerade, who are known to be slightly off or very off compared to others, often described as insane. And a fish milk is somebody who just picks up a fish and just smacks people with it because they're just that crazy. It's a dangerous situation to be in, because some people are like totally fine with the idea of somebody who's just very, very stupid and engaging in that humor, or somebody who's insane, who is insane in a wacky way as opposed to a more serious one. And if everyone at your table is okay with it, then that's fine. But you got to get that buy-in. This is one of those situations in which you got to make sure that everybody at the table, including you, are okay with what's happening. Malkavians were not designed to be fish milks. Yeah, it was a picture of a Malkavian in Dark Ages First Edition. The danger when you decide to play somebody who revels in their insanity or their stupidity is that you can appear quite insensitive to the situation that there are people out there who are genuinely not sane or not smart, but also the idea that you are then calling back either the D1000 because you're just chaotic, you're a chaotic force, and therefore the game can't find foundation, or you are making light of something that other players would rather that you not make light of. I used to think that I could not play with a fish milk. I subsequently have and been like, it was all right. But that's because the nature of that campaign meant that it didn't really matter that much. And I just adjusted my play for it. I was like, all right, well, fine. If things are going to be a little more humor tinged and a little more wacky, then I'll just make my character a little more humor tinged and a little more wacky. And that's what everybody did. And it ended up working out just fine. There wasn't a problem. So this kind of character could work, but I probably would have preferred to have been asked about this sort of thing. Now, I actually joined the game late, so it was on me to make the adjustment. So in that case, it wasn't reasonable for me to be asked. I had to be the one to figure it out. But just be careful about deciding to play somebody who is overtly unintelligent. Just make sure that everyone else is okay with it. We good? This one's a pretty simple one. Then we're coming on to another esoteric reference. The Miko Miyazaki. Miko Miyazaki was a character in the webcomic The Order of the Stick, an example of a lawful stupid paladin. These are characters who follow two simple rules. Anybody who transgresses my code of ethics is an enemy, and anyone who is my enemy must be destroyed. This is an extreme way of playing, because as much as you can say, oh yeah, no, you just have a strict moral code and I respect that, or hey, you're somebody who absolutely has to follow their code and you can get into danger because of it, all of those are fine. But the issue with the Miko is that then they can start using it as an excuse to govern other players' behavior. Because the instant that they cross your line, you can turn on them and then claim that it's something your character has to do. This is a case of extremes. And as we've mentioned with other character types when it comes to extremes, sounds kind of fascist. It doesn't sound kind of fascist. It is kind of fascist. You thought this was going to be the random anime character that shows up as genre setting that doesn't fit. We kind of covered that one already, Mistrich. We sort of covered that with the unbalanced equilibrium. But there's also a couple of other ones that we're going to get to that will also include that. So don't worry, we're going to cover it. Extremes are where you run into issues. Talk with your character and say, remember that you're going to have a reason to travel with this group, and this group may not always abide by your code. What would happen then? Get them to start thinking about it first. Start thinking about what would they do when confronted with that idea. And if they're like, oh, maybe they'd have a crisis of faith and they start reconsidering why they wanted to do this, and maybe they'd come to a conclusion about how they should act in the future, maybe that's a character that can work. But if you have somebody who's like, well, if somebody disobeys my code of ethics, then I'd have no choice. I'd have to attack them. Then you can point out, once again, you have to have a reason to travel with your group. You have to have a reason to get along with them. And it isn't just you wanting to get along with them. They have to want to get along with you. And if you are constantly talking about how everyone else is an awful person, then you can be the problem. So that actually applies to a bunch of the things that I said before. It isn't just about why you would go with the group. It also has to be why the group would want to have you around. Because if all you do when you're with the group is you attack them, or you insult them, or you make them feel badly, or you cause problems for them, then it's reasonable to assume that they'll find a shallow grave for you at some point, bury you in it, and keep going. And when everybody asks, hey, what happened to that guy? They'll be like, I don't know. Because you made them do it. So just be careful about that. It's what my character would do is the worst offense. Just make your character not do that. This is something that I would say, if you have established that your character would act in a certain way and people act surprised about it, but people are generally okay with it, then that's great. But using it as a defense when everyone else is angry about what you've done, that's when you have to re-examine. And it might be that the examination is this character isn't right for this game. There's nothing inherently incorrect about admitting to yourself that your character doesn't fit and that you might need to make a different one. So, hey, congrats, Kung Fu Fenris. Are we okay on the Miko? Can we move on from this? Mistrich points out, I usually tie this in with the dick thief. Like, you need to figure out why you don't do that in the group or how that actually fits in with the dynamic. Moving on. The Twisted Paragon. So the Twisted Paragon is kind of an alteration on the Miko. This one's pretty simple. This is somebody who claims that they're lawful good, except that all they want to do is they're psychotic. They want to kill people. They want to kill everything that moves. Whatever they don't kill, they want to fuck. And whenever they don't fuck, they want to rob. These are psychopaths who still claim that they are normal members of society. The reason why I mentioned lawful good is because often people will write down on their sheet their alignment, lawful good, and then just do whatever the fuck they want. It is not Liz's paladin in the web series LARPs. She never claimed to be lawful good. She just did what she thought was important. Now, obviously, every character in that show has issues with their role playing. That's the whole point. Nobody's perfect. But she's not a good example of this particular example because she isn't claiming to be normal. She isn't claiming to be lawful good. In which case, what you have to do here is you got to sit the player down and point out the inconsistencies. So you claim that you are lawful good, and yet you have done these things that are clearly not lawful good. What can we do in order to make this make sense? And if the person just has a really twisted code of ethics, see all the other examples that we've had, make sure that a character with a twisted code of ethics can still operate in that universe itself. We okay on the Twisted Paragon? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We've got 9 left, and we have 25 minutes. So we got to move. The amoral boxer is the one who is like, I don't care about anything except for finding my next great fight. I have nothing that attaches me to this world except for the opportunity to be in combat. I would hand this back. If I was a teacher, I'd hand this back with a big red incomplete on it. And I'd say your character needs to be about more than just this. Your character can absolutely relish the idea of a good fight. That could be why they choose to fight. It could be their reason for fighting, but they have to have a reason to live as well. They have to have a reason to be with a group and participate in the adventure. If literally the only thing to care about is that one thing, then they are in fact an example of a side quest, and we don't want that. So if your only thing is, I just want to fight, that's all I want, that's all I care about, my character just lives to best or be bested in combat, come up with more. It works great as an antagonist, not as a PC, says Pukajutsu. You make a good point there. Are we good on the amoral boxer? The world champion. So the world champion wants to start as being the best of a certain thing. And their fantasy is that they are the best. So oftentimes this will be sword fighting. I am the best sword fighter in the world. No one can best me with a blade. Well, I would point out that if this is the main key part of your character, that you are the best, then it's going to feel really fucking stupid when the dice show that you're not, that you can be bested. I would also point out that oftentimes player characters cannot be the best at something because it means that they have nowhere to go. Yep, the GM can say anything you can do, I can do better, and that's absolutely true. I would say that if this fantasy was important to somebody and I wanted to let them have it, then I just wouldn't create a better swordsman or swordsperson or whatnot. But I would just point out that if we're talking about somebody who says that the definition of their character is that they want to be the best, ask them what happens when it turns out that your character is not. Because I guarantee you that there will be times where your character is not. This can be especially annoying if you have two people who've decided they want to have the same goal and that they're constantly fighting with each other. And it's not then about like, I have a healthy rival, and it's more about I've wrapped up my identity in being the best. And when I'm not the best, then I'm not truly playing my character. You cannot make a character goal that involves outside people and expect it to always be true, because you do not control what outside people can or can't do. If you say, I am the world's best swordsperson, what you are saying is no one else can be the world's best swordsperson, and you can't control them, especially because one of the people who's sitting at the table is most likely the storyteller. So encourage them to examine what happens when you are not, and how will that go for you? Because I guarantee you that it will probably, well, I can say that it will probably happen. I can guarantee it. We good on the world champion? Moving on to the Zuko, and unfortunately I do not mean the Danny Zuko. Could maybe also nudge them into specifics, perhaps. Maybe not the best swordsman, but perhaps the best swordsman in a specific style. Then perhaps they could be defeated and not put a smudge on their record. I don't think that necessarily works as well, Requiem. And the reason why is that, good night, Luke. The reason why it doesn't necessarily work at that point is because oftentimes the fantasy here involves being the best, not just being a master of something, but actually being the perpetual winner. And that doesn't work as well, because then if you say I'm the best in a specific style, then they don't get that fantasy, because then you can say, great, well then other people beat your style, and then they're like, well, but that doesn't mean I'm the best anymore. So I'm not sure that example necessarily works. The Zuko is somebody who is horrible and wants to be redeemed. Named after the character Prince Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender, this is a character who feels the need to atone and redeem themselves for previous acts. This is a danger type of PC, because often you'll get somebody who comes in and they say that they want to have done something absolutely and truly evil, and then they just want everyone to accept and redeem them instantly, especially the player characters. And again, this is shifting your emotional burden onto others to make your story work. In a scripted series, this is a lot easier because that's the whole point. But in a collaborative storytelling effort, you don't necessarily get to make the call of when other people get to forgive you, if at all. I just finished watching something. I won't say what it was because I don't want to spoil it for people who may or may not be watching it themselves, where at the end, everyone just kind of forgives the bad guy except for one person. And that one person is like, I don't think I'm ever going to be able to forgive that person, which I'm like, okay, at least you put that in there. That's good. But like, it seemed odd that everyone just sort of forgave them right away. And the thing is that if you do that, then you can start getting a dissonance at the table where you'll have somebody who's like, well, I don't want to forgive your character. And you shouldn't have to be forced to forgive the character, in which case you are violating the everybody travels together. Well, world champion. Okay, so Mr. Rich, the definition of world champion is somebody who does never want to lose. It's not somebody who wants to find out what happens when they lose. I'm urging them away from I never lose into being like, wouldn't it be interesting to find out what happens if you lost? So the redemption storyline is something that can absolutely be cool, but you have to temper it a little bit. First of all, it can't be something that's so evil that you are irredeemable. The second is you can't expect everybody to redeem you. And the third is if the only thing that you care about is your own redemption, then you are a one-note character. And this is common when it comes to redemption storylines because they're obsessed with their honor. and that they must regain it or whatever. So redemption arcs absolutely can work. The problem is when somebody starts the game basically saying, I did horrible, horrible things and I want people to forgive me, because they don't earn that forgiveness. Remind them that they're going to have to earn it if they want to keep going. Moving on. We're getting close. Boop. The Luke Skywalker. So the reason why this is the Luke Skywalker is not because you are a Jedi or whatever. The Luke Skywalker is the character who believes that everyone is worthy of redemption. Now, in and of itself, this can be an interesting choice and an interesting choice to make. But there are games in which there's going to be a bad guy, and the bad guy is just bad and cannot be redeemed. Sometimes a story can be really fun if the point of the story is that you go up against the bad and you defeat the bad, and that's great. Not always, oh, but we found a way to bring them back to the light, because that might not be the story that you want to tell. This is a situation where if a player is super dedicated to the idea of I can redeem anyone, that you are then saying, well, you are then determining what the result is of the story and saying that if that result doesn't occur, you are not going to be happy. It's an extreme. It is actually, as opposed to an extreme, it's an absolute. So having a character interested in trying to redeem people, good. Having a character who insists that redemption is the only way, be careful. Because anytime that you insist on the outcome, you are forcing that outcome on everybody or accepting that you aren't going to get what you want. So that's what we're looking at for the Luke Skywalker. Moving on. Got 5 left. We have 15 minutes. The Jared Leto. This is the so this is an awkward word, but an awkward name, but I'm gonna explain it. This is the bad Joker. The Joker that people don't want around. This is the PC who is a dissonant comic relief character in a game that doesn't ask for it. This is the person who wants to come in and be super fucking wacky in a game that's supposed to be grimdark. The game with, deep political or spy intrigue, and meanwhile they're there and they're like, waha, look, I'm walking on my hands. A bad Joker. Encourage the player to find a way to have their character match the agreed upon tone and mood that everyone else has agreed upon in session 0, if they're the only holdout. If they're not the only holdout, consider that maybe the game isn't correct, because clearly not everybody is buying into it right now. The idea of playing comic relief can be interesting, but it is more important that everybody kind of buys into the game right away instead of people unilaterally deciding what kind of game it's going to be, which is why I'm actually going to tie this together with the next one, which is the Fan-Fortastic, which is the grimdark in a game that is intentionally trying to be lighthearted. So these are both problem characters, but for different reasons. For both of these, I would recommend that you encourage the player to reflect on how the game is panning out, how everyone else is saying, and then asking, is this game right for you? Because if it's not, if they're like, no, I want to play comic where it's grimdark, or I want to play grimdark where it's lighthearted, then they should perhaps not play in this game. Because remember, it's okay for a game not to match you. I have games with people who I really like playing with, and I've said I don't want to play because it's not the kind of game I'd be interested in. And that doesn't make me a bad role player, and it doesn't make them bad role players. It just means it just wasn't for me at that point in time. But assuming that the player's like, no, I want to play in this game, then you have to encourage them to start fitting the tone and mood that everyone else has agreed to a little bit better. Once they've done that, then you can say, look, there are times where you can still inject a bit of levity in Grimdark, and you can inject a bit of seriousness in a lighthearted game, as long as you can read the room, as long as you can understand when this is going to work out better. So once they have that, once they've started appreciating this, that's how it's going to work. So to sum up, is this game correct for you? And if the game is correct for you, how can you make yourself fit the game that everyone else has decided? We good on the Jared Leto and the Fanfortastic? These are fucking esoteric names. I don't know why I went this way, but oh well, I did. The Crouching Idiot Hidden Badass. This is similar to the Uxbridge, but with different motivations. The Crouching Idiot Hidden Badass is somebody who pretends to suck, but is secretly amazing. I changed this a little bit from when it was suggested. When it was suggested, the idea was somebody who's completely stupid but is secretly a badass. That kind of fits more with the Thick Barbarian. So I took the idea of Crouching Idiot Hidden Badass and molded it to this. It is the person who is hiding their ability and then is going to bust it out later on. Well, this can actually be really interesting, but there are a couple of things that I would make the player aware of before they start. The first is, once you have made your reveal, is your character still going to be interesting to play? Because sometimes basing your idea around a secret that you're carrying means that once that secret is revealed, you're no longer that cool. Second thing is, if you are playing this, are you going to make it so that other players won't trust you? That trust is kind of essential. It's important to be able to maintain trust while you're playing. And how's this different from the Kevin Uxbridge? So the Kevin Uxbridge is, I refuse to use my abilities, but I have godlike ability that I can call upon. I just refuse to use it because of a moral code. Because what the fantasy there is, I dare not use this incredible power that I have. Because in fact, what they're doing is they're getting away with playing a character with incredible power with it's okay because I'm just never going to use it, which isn't necessarily fair to the other players, because also inevitably the temptation grows too great and they use it. This is a case in which you are like, I have built a character who's just going to pretend that they're an idiot and then bust out the I'm not an idiot later on, or pretend that they're hapless and instead are being hapful. The issue is trust. If you pretend that you're awful at things and the other player characters don't know that you're pretending, and then one day you are like, no, I've actually been good at this the entire time, that can actually cause out of character resentment. We could have done this had you revealed this before. This problem wouldn't have been an issue had you been around. My character wouldn't have been hurt if you had just, instead of it being like oh, that's an interesting moment, players might see this as, hey, but you fucked with my story because you just decided not to tell everyone. So for a Crouching Idiot Hidden Badass, my recommendation would be, do not keep this a secret from the table. Let them know right from the start and see if they're okay with it. But don't keep it a secret from other players. Keeping it a secret from other players will not go as well as you'd hoped, unless it's a one-shot. For a one-shot, this character concept is just fine. We're moving on. We got 2 left. The Hammer. So the Hammer is not a reference to Nathan Fillion's character in Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog. The Hammer is a reference to the fact that when you have a hammer, every problem starts to look like a nail. This is sort of a sum up of a bunch of the tropes that we've seen earlier. The idea that my character is good at something and will try to solve every problem by doing what they're good at. If it's violence, they'll try to solve problems with violence. If it's negotiation, they'll try to negotiate with everything. If it's I was thinking of Hammer Time. Fair. If it's seduction, they'll try to solve problems with seduction. But in this case, the problem ends up being not this is how I try to deal with all my problems. The problem is, if this doesn't work, then I get upset because I failed. Oftentimes with things like the Casanova, it doesn't matter if they succeed or fail. It's just that's what they always try. With the hammer, it's I want this to go the way that I decide because that's what my character's good at. And when the dice fail me, because typically the dice will eventually fail you, I'm going to get upset that my character couldn't do the thing that they were good at. It also means that if you have a bad guy show up and you're like, well, my character is good at negotiation, and you're like, well, there is no negotiating with this bad guy, then you're like, but look at all these game systems that say that I can successfully negotiate. Like, I'm very good at negotiation. The game says that I can negotiate, so that's clearly what's going to happen. This is an issue often with hyper specialized characters or min-maxed characters. Min-maxed characters make sacrifices on their character sheet in order to be good at other things. So they're awful at some things and great at others. And they just try to manipulate the events of the game so that they're always using the things they're good at and never using the things they're bad at, or making it so that other people in the group have to make up for their shortcomings. And they'll say, you deal with that. Yeah, if I can't X out a situation Y, then I am useless. And not useless, then it's I don't want to play. Because some people enjoy being useless. But in this case, it's, well, if I can't do it, then it's not worth doing. This is a situation in which you need to encourage the player to reevaluate how they're seeing problem solving in the game and about the game itself, to explain that luck is going to play a factor, that the reason we have dice is to introduce chance and entropy and chaos into a game, and you cannot rely on always winning all the time. And that you also need to find situations in which your character just won't be as effective. Encourage them to create less of a min-maxed build if they have difficulty with the idea of not being good at something. Some people do enjoy being useless. Useless is actually one of the harshest insults that I can think of. But in this case, I'm not using it as an insult. So if you run into that situation, if you've got a hammer, this is a player education moment. And then also an encouragement to realize that in some games, you also have to have losers in order to have winners. Are we good on the hammer? We have one left and we have little time. The murder hobo. So the murder hobo is the character who comes in and just wants to kill everybody. They kill everybody because that is, this is less of a, I'm good at killing. It's less of a, I have a strange moral code. It's more, I enjoy interacting with the idea that my character can be psychotic, that my character can be a murderer. So it kind of depends here, because you can have one of three situations. The first is somebody who's new to role-playing, who believes that the game is about murder because it involves combat. So if they come across anybody who they don't like, they just murder them because they also figure that there are no consequences. They don't think about consequences, in which case the way that you deal with this is you educate the player about consequences. You introduce the carrot and stick. You do things that are good, then you get rewarded. You do things that are bad, and you get hit. You kill somebody and they don't deserve to die, or you kill somebody in an area where there are laws against murder, you actually have to throw the book at them. So if you see somebody submit this character in advance, you can nip this in the bud by reminding them, okay, but if your character is just about killing, there's going to be times where killing is going to be wrong. What do you do about that? The second scenario is that you get somebody who is tired of playing somebody who's like reasonable or social minded. Somebody who's just like, no, I just want to play a character to hit things, make them fall down. I just want to have that release of being a murder hobo. Encourage them to find a game where being a murder hobo will work out. They already know about consequence and they don't care. So in this particular situation, what you're trying to do is you're trying to discover ways to let them get the murder hobo out of them. So play a game where being a murder hobo is a great idea. Paranoia is a fantastic example of this. Play Paranoia. Play a dungeon crawl. Just don't understand that what they're going for is catharsis and release. Not this isn't about like the permanent way that they want to play, or that they just deliberately want to ignore a consequence. And the final situation that you'll run into a murder hobo is with somebody who is genuinely not someone you should be playing with. These are the kind of people who just delight in the idea of killing people. They're trolls. They're trolling the game. These are the same people who troll in online video games. These are the same people who troll in forums, on Discord servers, everything else. It's all too common. Don't give into that. Don't let them play. This is a hard no. If somebody has shown up to troll you, you do not need to give them the benefit of the doubt. Trolls do not need to be innocent until proven guilty. If you don't have a good feeling about it, you don't need to consult with anything. It's your game. You can do what you like. Yeah, you've had those games where you just want to roll dice and kill baddies for 3 hours. See, that's totally fine. And that's great. But if your game involves not just killing baddies and all they want to do is kill, especially if it's because they're like, but I like the idea of killing things, then they're trolling you and they just need to stop. Or they're genuinely psychopathic, in which case you have bigger problems than I can resolve in one of these. Are we good with murder hobos? Time goes on yes. 1 hour, 48 minutes, and 14 seconds for 32 character types, what they are, why they're a problem, and how to deal with them. So there it is. Trouble PC tropes are something that you will encounter both as a player and as a storyteller. Not all of them are an instant no. In fact, most of them are stuff that you can work with, but it involves communication, and it involves also figuring out the root cause and sourcing it out. A reminder, tomorrow will be more Punch Effect at 6 o'clock Eastern Eastern Daylight Time over at twitch.tv/Elizabeth A. Neal. I think Drew Crew isn't happening again this Saturday, but Punchy Book Club on Sunday at, I believe, 1 p.m. They will be talking about The Wicked and the Divine. That's over again on Elizabeth A. Neal's channel. And then on Sunday at 6 p.m., it is Exalted Academy Season 2. If you didn't watch Season 1, it's cool. This is the best time for you to step in, because it's a new adventure, even though it's the same players. Got a not a scrub splash for this? No, I don't. Not in this right here. And hey, if you do want to participate, if you do want to watch Season 2 and you really wish that you knew what happened in Season 1, it's okay. We got you covered. We have a 2-minute video that you can watch. It's just 2 minutes, but it'll fill you in on everything you need to know, everything you need to know to be able to appreciate and watch Season 2. And I hope to see as many people as we can there as well. Hey, Aragwen, it's good to see you here. Here at the end of all things. But it is time for me to eat some dinner. It's time for all of you to go and do something awesome, I hope. And I will be seeing you soon. Just remember that it might be difficult, but your best bet for almost every problem you have when it comes to role-playing is to use your word hole. I'll see you next time.